There's a number on your doctor's wall, and if your blood pressure goes above it, you'll be medicated, monitored, or told to try harder. That number, 120/80, has been the gold standard for blood pressure management for decades. It's taught in medical schools. It's printed on every blood pressure cuff sleeve. It sits on a laminated chart in waiting rooms across the country. And doctors aren't making it up. They're following the guidelines they were trained on. But here is what those guidelines don't account for: your age. Research published in major cardiology journals is now forcing a fundamental rethink of blood pressure targets for adults over 60. And what it's revealing is going to surprise you and may explain something you've been quietly living with for longer than you realize. Because the blood pressure number that protects a 45-year-old's heart and arteries can cause dizziness, falls, kidney damage, and the gradual, invisible loss of independence in a 75-year-old. By the end of this video, you will know the correct blood pressure range for your exact age group. You'll understand the 5 factors that shift your personal target, and you'll know precisely what to ask at your next doctor's appointment. But the numbers aren't coming yet, because without understanding why they're different, the numbers alone won't protect you. Raymond was 74 years old when the dots finally got connected. His previous doctor had been delighted with his blood pressure, 118/72, right on target, perfectly controlled. By every chart in every clinic, Raymond was a success story. But Raymond had stopped driving 6 months earlier. He didn't feel safe behind the wheel. The dizziness came too quickly when he turned his head. He'd stopped walking to the park at the end of his street. He'd stopped hosting his grandchildren for Sunday dinners because getting up and down from chairs made the room tilt. His world had quietly, invisibly shrunk to the size of his living room, and Raymond assumed that was just aging. His doctor assumed the numbers looked great. Nobody connected those two things. When a specialist finally ran an orthostatic blood pressure test, measuring how his pressure changed when he moved from sitting to standing, his systolic pressure dropped 32 points in under 3 seconds. That wasn't aging. That was over-medication. His blood pressure had been pushed so low that his aging vascular system couldn't compensate fast enough when he changed position. The brain wasn't getting enough blood. The dizziness was a symptom. The shrinking world was the consequence. The guideline that had protected Raymond at 55 was quietly dismantling his life at 74. You've been told lower is always better. That's true up to a point, but at a certain age, lower stops being protective and starts being dangerous. And that point is different for every decade of life after 60. The problem isn't any individual doctor. Most are doing exactly what they were trained to do. The problem is that the blood pressure guidelines most commonly used today were built largely on studies of middle-aged adults, not seniors, not people in their 70s or 80s with arterial systems that have changed significantly over half a century. When those guidelines are applied, without adjustment, to a 72-year-old, the results can look perfect on paper and feel devastating in real life. And almost no one is talking about it. If Raymond's story already sounds familiar, if you've experienced unexplained dizziness, fatigue, or a creeping sense that something changed after a medication adjustment, type the word Raymond in the comments right now. It only takes a second, and it helps this video reach the next person who needs it. If this kind of evidence-based, age-specific health information matters to you, please subscribe now and hit the bell. There's more coming that you won't want to miss. To understand why blood pressure targets must change with age, there is one core concept you need to understand first: vascular stiffness. In your 30s and 40s, your arteries were flexible. When the heart pumped blood, the arterial walls expanded to absorb that pressure, then recoiled, like elastic. That elastic recoil is what keeps diastolic pressure, the bottom number, in a healthy range. After the age of 60, arterial walls begin to accumulate calcification and structural changes that reduce that flexibility. In plain language, your arteries get stiffer. They can't expand and recoil the way they once did. and stiff pipes require more pressure to move the same volume of fluid. This is why a systolic pressure, the top number of 138 in a 72-year-old, may be completely appropriate, physiologically expected. Not a warning sign, but a natural adaptation to arterial changes that happen in every aging body. Pushing that same 72-year-old down to 120 doesn't undo the stiffness. It simply reduces the volume of blood reaching the brain, the kidneys, and the heart itself. That is the biological reality that changes everything about blood pressure management for seniors. And now, with that foundation in place, here are the numbers. Age Group 1. Ages between 60 to 64. Target range 125 to 134, over 70 to 84. MMHG. In the early 60s, arterial stiffness is beginning, but it hasn't fully taken hold. The vascular system still retains moderate flexibility. The autonomic nervous system, the part of the body that regulates blood pressure moment to moment, still responds relatively quickly. This means the shift away from the universal 120/80 target should begin here, but it's a measured shift. The evidence supports a systolic target of 125 to 134 for most adults in this age group. This range offers meaningful protection against stroke and heart attack while avoiding the risks that come with aggressive lowering. The danger in this decade is one of confidence. Many people in their early 60s still feel young. They're active, energetic, and their doctors often apply younger adult targets without any adjustment. Consider Patricia. She was 61 when a routine appointment flagged a blood pressure reading of 136. Her doctor, following standard guidelines, increased her medication. 3 weeks later, Patricia had fallen in her kitchen. A minor fall, as it turned out, but she'd been noticing worsening dizziness since the change. When her standing blood pressure was measured 60 seconds after rising from a chair, it had dropped to 102 systolic. Her body simply couldn't compensate quickly enough. At 136, her blood pressure had been appropriate for her age and arterial status. The chart said otherwise. A medication adjustment resolved the problem. Patricia hasn't fallen since. Stay with this through all 4 age groups because the shift that occurs between 74 and 75 is the most significant and the most widely misunderstood of any transition in senior blood pressure care. Age Group 2. Ages between 65 to 74. Target range 130 to 139 over 70 to 89 MHG. Between 65 and 74, arterial stiffness accelerates. The aorta, the body's main artery, begins to lose significant elasticity. The speed at which pressure waves travel through the arteries increases substantially, and the heart has to work harder to push blood through a less cooperative vascular system. A systolic reading of 130 to 139 is not a warning sign in this age group. For many people, it is physiologically appropriate, and increasingly, the research supports treating it that way. A major analysis published in a leading medical journal found that in adults over 65, aggressively lowering systolic pressure below 130 was associated with increased risk of kidney injury, falls, and hospitalization, not decreased risk, increased. The bottom number diastolic also takes on critical importance at this stage. A diastolic pressure below 60 in adults over 65 is now recognized as a significant risk factor for heart attack. The reason is specific. Coronary arteries, the vessels that supply the heart muscle itself, fill with blood during the diastolic phase, when the heart is at rest between beats. If that pressure is too low, the heart muscle doesn't receive enough blood to sustain itself. Low diastolic pressure in a senior doesn't indicate a relaxed heart. It may indicate a heart that isn't receiving enough blood to safely beat again. Raymond's diastolic pressure, while fully medicated, was routinely in the mid-50s. His doctor was following the chart precisely. The chart was built for a different body than Raymond's. If you are between 65 and 74, and your readings are consistently sitting between 130 to 139 over 75 to 85, there is a specific question worth asking before agreeing to any medication increase. Ask your doctor, has my orthostatic blood pressure been tested? If the answer is no, it needs to be. The next age group is where the stakes become highest, and where the gap between standard guidelines and individual need is at its widest. If you've never heard this before, if no one has ever explained to you that your blood pressure target should change with your age, type the word "finally" in the comments, because you are not alone. And what you share helps other seniors watching this video right now feel seen. Age Group 3. Ages between 75 to 84. Target range: 135 to 145 over 70 to 90, mmHg. Between 75 and 84, the consequences of blood pressure that is pushed too low become more severe, more sudden, and more permanent. Three things have changed significantly inside the body at this stage. The baroreceptors sensors in the carotid arteries that detect blood pressure fluctuations have slowed considerably. In younger adults, they respond in milliseconds. By 75, that response takes seconds. That gap is the window in which dizziness and falls occur. Cerebral autoregulation, the brain's ability to maintain its own steady blood supply despite changing pressure levels, has diminished. The brain of a 78-year-old operates across a narrower pressure range than it did at 50. Push the pressure too low, and the brain simply doesn't receive enough blood. Kidney function has declined by roughly 30 to 40% compared to middle age. The kidneys depend on adequate blood pressure to filter effectively. Aggressive medication can starve them of the pressure they require, accelerating the very organ damage the medication was meant to prevent. A systolic pressure of 135 to 145 is not dangerous in this age group. It may be actively protective. A landmark clinical trial on blood pressure in the very elderly used a systolic target of 150 and still demonstrated significant benefit over no treatment at all. More recent data supports bringing that figure down somewhat, but not to 120. Not for this physiology. This surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time. Dorothy was 79 sharp, organized, entirely self-sufficient. She did her own shopping, managed her own finances, cooked every meal. Her blood pressure had been running at 145 over 88 for several years. A new cardiologist, following the most recent adult guidelines, started her on 2 medications with a target of 130 systolic. Within 6 weeks, Dorothy's daughter called in a panic. Dorothy had fallen twice. She'd stopped cooking. Standing at the stove made her feel faint. She was afraid to shower without someone nearby. Her blood pressure, by that point, was 122 over 68. Perfectly on guideline. Profoundly wrong for Dorothy. The medication was adjusted. Dorothy's pressure settled at 142 over 84. Within 2 weeks, she was back in her kitchen. Within a month, she was back at the shops. She told her daughter she felt like she'd been handed her life back. A number on a chart doesn't tell you whether someone can live their life. The goal of blood pressure treatment is not a number. It is the person behind it. Age Group 4. Ages 85 and above. Target range. Individualized typically between 140 to 150 over 70 to 90 mmHg. Guided by functional status and quality of life. At 85 and beyond, the research is unambiguous on one point. The goal of treatment shifts entirely. It is no longer about lowering a number. It is about protecting a life. In this age group, there is no universal blood pressure target, and that is intentional. Management must be built around what cardiologists call functional status: overall physical resilience, cognitive function, fall history, kidney function, and crucially, the individual's own goals and wishes. What the evidence does consistently show, a systolic pressure between 140 and 150 is generally well tolerated in this age group and often appropriate. Aggressive lowering below 130 in adults over 85 has been linked repeatedly in studies to increased mortality, not decreased. The risk of orthostatic hypotension, the dangerous pressure drop on standing, is at its highest in this group and is a primary cause of falls and hip fractures. Every hip fracture in a person over 85 carries a one-year mortality rate of 20 to 30%. That single statistic should give every prescribing physician to pause before lowering an 87-year-old blood pressure further. The question at 85 is not, what does the guideline say? The question is, what allows this person to remain independent, to function, to live with dignity? And the answer to that question may require a blood pressure number that no guideline committee ever envisioned. If someone at 86 is alert, mobile, and managing their own life, and their blood pressure is 148/82, that may be exactly where they should be. Treating the number instead of the person could cost them everything that makes life worth living. Knowing the age group target is the foundation, but 5 individual factors can shift that window meaningfully, and understanding them is what turns a general number into a personalized one. Factor 1. Kidney function. The kidneys act as both a regulator and a victim of blood pressure. If your GFR, your glomerular filtration rate, the standard measure of kidney function, is below 60, your blood pressure target may need to sit slightly higher. Kidneys with reduced function require more perfusion pressure to filter the blood effectively. Aggressive lowering in the presence of chronic kidney disease can accelerate its progression, the exact opposite of the intended outcome. Factor 2. Presence of diabetes. Diabetes damages blood vessels in a specific and accelerated way. It speeds up arterial stiffening beyond what age alone produces. The cardiovascular risk associated with elevated blood pressure is amplified in diabetic seniors. Most current guidance recommends a slightly lower systolic target for diabetic adults over 65, around 130 to 135. But the diastolic floor still holds. Below 60 diastolic remains hazardous regardless of diabetes status. Factor 3. History of stroke, or TIA. If there is a history of stroke or transient ischemic attack, a mini-stroke blood pressure management becomes more nuanced. In the period immediately after a stroke, higher pressures are often deliberately maintained to preserve brain perfusion. Long-term, secondary prevention targets generally aim for 130 or below systolic. But the pace of any medication change matters enormously. Rapid lowering in a post-stroke brain can trigger ischemia, a dangerous reduction in blood flow in areas that are already compromised. Factor 4. Orthostatic hypotension. Orthostatic hypotension is a drop of 20 or more points in systolic blood pressure, or 10 or more in diastolic, within 3 minutes of standing. If this is present, blood pressure targets must be managed with particular caution. Treating the seated or lying reading without accounting for what happens when a person stands is one of the most common and consequential oversights in senior blood pressure management. A lying to standing blood pressure measurement is a simple test. It is not routinely done. Ask for it by name. Factor 5. Multiple medications, polypharmacy. If 5 or more medications are being taken, which is the case for a significant proportion of adults over 70, blood pressure management becomes a systems challenge rather than a single drug question. Diuretics for fluid retention, alpha blockers for prostate conditions, antidepressants, sedatives, many carry blood pressure lowering effects that aren't prominently listed. The cumulative effect can push pressure into dangerous territory without any single drug being the obvious cause. A comprehensive medication review by a pharmacist or a geriatric specialist is not optional. It is essential. If you have been living with dizziness, with fatigue that doesn't quite make sense, with a body that feels somehow less than it used to, while a chart on the wall says everything looks fine, you are not imagining things. You are not being dramatic. You are not being difficult. You are not failing at your own health. You may simply be living in a body that science has finally caught up to. Raymond got his life back. Patricia stopped falling. Dorothy returned to her kitchen. These aren't exceptional cases. These are what happens when the number on the chart is matched to the actual human being, not the other way around. Your blood pressure target is not one universal number. It is a range that belongs to you, shaped by your age, your history, your kidney function, and what you need to live fully. Before the next appointment, there are 5 specific things worth doing. Write down the name and dose of every blood pressure medication currently being taken. Ask for a lying to standing blood pressure test, also called an orthostatic blood pressure assessment. Ask what the GFR reading was on the most recent blood test. Ask directly, given my age, is this blood pressure target appropriate for someone over your age? If those questions are dismissed without explanation, consider a second opinion from a geriatrician or a cardiologist with specific experience in older adults. One informed conversation with a doctor can change a medication. A changed medication can restore a life. That is not an exaggeration. For Raymond, for Dorothy, for Patricia, it was exactly that. If this video gave you something real, something you didn't know before you pressed play, type the word numbers in the comments below. Just that one word. It tells us this reached you. And it helps the algorithm put this video in front of the next senior who needs it. Share this with someone you love, a parent, a sibling, a friend whose doctor recently changed their medication. Because the most important health information is often the kind that travels person to person, not from a chart on a wall.